Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder and it's time to talk about a topic which I picked up on after watching a podcast, I suppose you'd call it. ManyMilesAway and Napalm Rat did a talk and they were mainly focusing on German tanks and the issues they were having in the game, especially around the rank 4 area. Now, the conversation was spread over a lot of topics, and I would actually say, you know, go and listen to it for yourself. It was fun for me to listen to, especially while playing the game, so I would say, you know, go and check it out. At the same time, they brought up a lot of topics I'm not really going to talk about, because I either agree with them, or I just don't see how they're relevant, or they just didn't really have an end point to them. Like one of them, they were talking about one of the fixes would be to change the BR system after around BR4 or rank 3 in the German tree, but they didn't say how, so therefore it's very hard to comment on something like that. So instead, I'm going to take one of the aspects they talked about, and that was pretty much the new French tanks and how they are when it comes to the Germans. Now, it's pretty obvious that if you look at French tanks, they have massive advantages over the Germans in some ways. Mobility is one of them, the fact that they have auto-loaders, the penetration on a lot of their guns is pretty good, we'll say. They have a lot of factors that the Germans lack if you don't look at their premium vehicles. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean that they are unbeatable when it comes to the French, because the Germans have some advantages over the French. So they actually have useful armor. They have more stabilized guns. They also have better AA, in my opinion. And when it comes to the actual air mode, I think it's pretty even. A lot of people give it to the French because of the AD4, but then I don't think I would think the Bearcat is as good as something like an ME262, especially when we look at the Polkastora and the Gift 262 that people got a while ago. So I think in the air it's kind of evened out. There is no 6770 French jet that you know, France can call upon. But in rank 4 for Germany, there definitely is, in the 6.7 and the 7.0 bracket. So I think it's fair to say that since the French have been released, the German teams have been struggling even more than they have before. Now, I have talked about the issues that German teams have had before. I've offered some criticisms, I've offered some ways to improve it, and I feel like I should use this video to do exactly the same thing. Because, well, to be honest, it just makes sense. So we're going to go through a few ways that German teams can increase their win rates and, you know, just be a little bit more useful on the battlefield instead of getting steamrolled by stuff like Lorraine's. So the first thing to realize before we get into this is the French are still in a beta stage. Now, if we look at the aircraft for the French, a lot of the BRs of the aircraft were changed after they left the BR stage of the beta stage of the development, the open beta stage. Stuff like one of the VBs was changed, a few of the other fighters were changed, such as the MB157. So this may also happen to a lot of the French tanks, especially in rank 4. In my opinion, I think the Lorraine 40T will either go up to 6.7, 7.0, and I wouldn't actually be against raising the AMX-13 to 6.3, just because of how quick it is, and it gets rid of that monster lineup of the AMX-13, the AMX M4, and also the CA Lorraine, which can be really powerful, even though you don't have very good planes to go with it. But just remember that the BRs are subject to change right now. Also, the Lorraine 40T, which seems to be the main problem that a lot of people have, has the highest repair cost in the French tree, which isn't saying a lot because it's not very high, but it's just something to take into account. So we may see less and less of those over time as people start losing money when they're not doing as well in them. But anyway, let's get into some ways that German tankers can increase the odds of winning against these French tanks. And a lot of them are very similar to when I talked about Germans facing American or British tanks, with a few little caveats. So the first one is the idea that you are no longer top dog. Now, the way that the podcast went, they kept referring to a time where Germany was on top in the game. And this time was when Germany and only Russia were in the game. This basically meant that there was no other nations to compete with it, and there was also a very strict limit on how many tanks were actually in the game at the same time, such as the 105 Tiger was top dog in this system. We didn't have Leopards, we didn't have KPZs, we didn't have Begleit Panzers, or even Gepards, or even IS-6s, or I think the IS-3 was there, and the IS-4M was there, but stuff like the T-10M wasn't there. So these times are a very long time ago, and they brought up the fact that the Jagdtiger, of all things, used to be a really fun tank to use. And unfortunately, this is a get with the times thing. We've had a lot of additions to the game now, and a lot of them are incredibly good at what they do. A lot of 6.7 has been beefed up recently over the last few years. The T-34, T-29, a bunch of light tanks for the Americans, which now can scout. Stuff like the M46 being lowered in BR. For the British, you have an amazing lineup at rank 4, Cent Mark 3, Cent Mark 10 at 7.0, Carnarvon, the FV-4202, the Barn is also there. There are many wonderful machines for the British, and the French are no different. They also have some wonderful rank 4 machines. You've got to remember, back when it was only Germany and Russia, there was no answer to the Tiger II-H. And there was no answer to the Jagdtiger. There weren't any big, massive, high-penetrating Russian guns that you could face, meaning that you could get away with a lot of stuff that you just can't do nowadays against stuff like Sabo, stuff which is high velocity, which can fire for absolute miles, which is designed to go through your heavy armor. So the playstyle has to change, and wishing to go back to those times is a fool's errand. It is never going to happen unless you delete British and American Tier 4. On top of this, in the podcast, Napalm Ratter talked about how he doesn't like Cold War tanks facing World War II. Now, the issue is working out where Cold War tanks technically start and when World War II ones end. Now, after talking to Tazzy believes, from his point of view, anything after World War II is technically Cold War era tanks, because that's the next stage in military warfare. If you want to go a bit further, you have World War II to Vietnam, that's an area, and then after the Vietnam War, you have the Cold War era. But the issue with all of this is it depends what you mean by these two statements. Do you mean tanks which would have fought in the Cold War when it was about, compared to tanks in World War II? Or do you mean tanks which were around the Cold War era? And then, once again, what do you mean by that? So, if you mean Cold War tanks facing World War II tanks, I can't really think of any examples of tanks which were in active service when the Cold War, if it became a hot war, would have happened. I don't think there are any in game, and if there are, they're incredibly light tanks which aren't really going to face, which, you know, are not really designed to take on heavier tanks anyway, which the Germans have. At the same time, if we make this argument, we can also make the argument that the 105 Tiger and the Panther II are Cold War tanks, because they weren't produced in World War II. And if you want to make the argument, well, they would have been produced, then that argument means that they would have been produced, let's say, 46 or 47, so therefore they enter that period anyway, and they're not World War II tanks. So dropping those in BR to 6.7 would mean that you are breaking those own rules, even though they're not World War II tanks. Now, if you want to talk about just designing the tanks in World War II, and those can get into the game, well, there's a lot of very early designs of very powerful tanks, especially British tanks, which were made in World War II, which were built upon. Obviously, the Centurion Mark I was a World War II tank in 1944, but the Cent Mark III was a much later 50s model of the Centurion. But this means... there were plans for stuff like the Mark III in World War II. So would that make that a World War II tank, or would that make it a Cold War tank? See, there's a bit of issues here when you try and work it out in your head, and clarification is definitely required. Which is why saying that, oh well, we can't have World War II tanks versus Cold War tanks, it's an interesting thing to say, just like saying we need a BR system revamp, but in the major scale of things, it doesn't mean anything unless you clarify either what the new BR system is, or what you even mean by World War II versus Cold War tanks. So that is just something else to take into account. So let's talk about some playstyle things that the Germans can do. So the first things first. French tanks are incredibly aggressive. They have high mobility, they have auto-loading guns, but one thing they don't have is stabilization on those guns, and also amazing brakes. So at that point, they also don't have a lot of armor. So at that point, you look at an enemy like that, a very, very quick enemy which can flank you, which can get around you, which can go after you with its gun, and be able to penetrate the obvious areas of your front, such as like the cheek on a Tiger II turret. What you have to do is you have to play defensively. You have to create a wall. So on a 3 domination zone map, what you do is, as a team, or at least as a pack, like let's say a squad of 3 or 4, you hold an area, you wait for the French to push, you annihilate them because they can't shoot you on the move, and if they try and break, it takes them so long to steady their gun, you will have shot them, as long as you're paying attention for that 1 or 2 seconds when it actually counts. And the reason you have to play as a squad here is there is normally more than one French tank which is coming at you, because they're all coming down the same roads, because they're all playing as aggressively as each other. So therefore, defensive walls is a way to go forward. I understand that ManyMilesAway in the podcast did talk about how the game is centered around this idea of aggression, especially if you look at the 3-point idea, because you have to be aggressive to take the points. But the thing is, if you let the enemy take the first 2 points, let them push past it, nail that first wave, you can then push forward, take the center points, do exactly the same thing, set up defensive positions, and once that second wave comes in, you can annihilate them too. Because they'll be coming at you quickly, their guns won't be stabilized, and you can just nail them. It's the same way you deal with the British, but with the British it is harder, because they have stabilizers, but that is for another video. So that's how you deal with them from the aggressive point of view. You have to play into their game by playing defensive. If you try and match aggression with these fast, mobile, auto-loading machines, you're gonna get annihilated in stuff like your Tiger IIHs and stuff like your Panthers. You have to play defensive. Now, where do you shoot a French tank? Pretty much the turret. No French tank at rank 4 has enough armor to bounce really anything as long as you don't hit a harsh angle. And since the gun is the a big factor on the French tank, you should always aim for the turret. It is also something that will always be looking at you if they're coming at you. Now, the reason you shoot at the turret is because there isn't enough armor to stop the shell, the majority of the crew is there, and you're always guaranteed to knock out the cannon, because the cannon breach is nearly as big as the damn tank itself. If you look at the auto-loading mechanism on a Lorraine 40T or something like an AMX M4, you can have a look on the X-ray and realize that it's so huge, hitting it with any type size shell is easy to do. So just shooting it exactly where the gun mantlet is will knock out the whole of the turret, rendering the whole damn thing useless. At the same time, you can take out the turret ring, which once again will take out the machine. It's not a hard shot to make. It's not like on a Tiger 2H where you actually have to line up the cheek of the damn turret. It's not like an IS-4 where you have to try and line up that damn triangle which bounces half the time anyway, or a T-34 where you have to either go after the turret ring and miss that lip, or try and hit the upper glacis and it to bounce anyway for no reason, or maybe hit one of those tracks. No, you just shoot it wherever in the turret, and it won't bounce, it won't eat it. The cannon breach and everything around it will get annihilated by your 75s and 88s at rank 4. It is what happens. Now, another thing that was brought up was the fact that scouting was something that the Germans lacked because they had no light tanks apart from the RU-251. Now, they asked if this could be... well, they didn't ask. They want it to be rectified. But the issue is, if you want to stick with the rules that you were talking about, whereas World War II tanks with World War II tanks, Cold War tanks with Cold War tanks, you don't have any light tanks as Germany. It wasn't in the... well, maybe I shouldn't say that. I was going to say it wasn't in the doctrine, which I suppose it technically wasn't, but I don't think it's the right words to use. I think they were surplus to requirements. When you're on the defensive, you are not worried about reconnaissance and scout tanks, especially when you have stuff like SDKFZs, which did exactly the same thing. A lot of them were kitted out to do that exact thing. So therefore, the tanks were much more designed to actually face other tanks instead of these reconnaissance vehicles. And we also see a lot of vehicles, especially made by America, which were pretty much failed scouts, showing that it wasn't exactly the easiest thing to do. But anyway, looking at Germany itself, it did not have any of these light tanks by the end of the war. They were just not made. And there was no real designs for them, there was no real prototypes for them. The only one you could maybe get away with is a Lux, but a Lux is not a rank 4 vehicle. At best, it is a rank 3, around 4.43, especially with KV-1s and stuff like Jumbos running around, with its HVAP 30mm. So that's just a reality. And on the opposite side of it, when you look at the French, the AMX-13s exist. Now, there is the AMX-1390 at 7.0, which I think will actually get up-tiered, either 7.3 or 7.7. With its 320mm rounds, I think it is easily good enough to be able to be up-tiered, so at least take that into account, maybe that helps. But you have the AMX-13 at 6.0, and then you have the AMX-13 SS11 at 6.7. Now, these three vehicles I have been using a lot, and what I've found is when German tankers think that they're hid, when they're just slightly behind hills and you can still see the top of their turrets, you can scout them obviously, and they get destroyed, because they're not actually hiding. They are cheating. They are trying to get a little bit of an advantage by sitting just above where they should be to try and get a better view of the battlefield. But that means I can scout you. So when we talk about the matchup between French and German, you must understand that you will always be spotted. There will always be a cantankerous asshole like me in the match, or there'll be somebody else who is doing the same role as me, and this pretty much means that you will be spotted. Think that you are spotted. Cover your flanks. Understand that somebody will try and go around you because they don't want to face you head on. And this leads into the final point. Fight in pairs. Now I know what you're going to say, but I'm not in a squad. I didn't queue up with anyone. There was something I talked about in one of my videos. I was massively up-tiered in a vehicle, and it was a 5.7, it was the T25, I believe at the time, the American one, and I got myself into a 6-7 match. What I did was I found a random T34, stuck my arse to him, and followed him around the battlefield. Now luckily for me, this T34 driver, he knew what he was doing. He knew how to play the map, he knew how to bounce shots, he knew how to push forward, and I know how to support a tank like that. You wait for the enemies to shoot him, then you push, get a shot, keep doing that over and over again. Make sure that you survive and he takes the hits, but you try and do as much damage as you can, and then in the opposite kind of way, if he is damaged, what you have to do is try and soak fire, or try and soak shots going in your direction, trying to make sure you don't get hit. So even if you're not in a squad with a German teammate, find someone on the battlefield at the start of the battle, maybe similar tank would help you, and just follow him around. And if he is on one side of a building, looking down at a street, you go on the other side of the building. If he is trying to sort out a road, you support him. You make sure that if that dude gets shot, you shoot back. There is no way that a team can get a shot on him and be able to either survive or not take damage. And that is a key philosophy that I've taken through War Thunder for many years, and it served me really well. And for German tanks, with their high-powered long 88s, and their 75s, and the bloody 128 from the damn Sturm Meal, and the Jagdtiger with its 128 as well, I believe it's a 128, this should be the philosophy as well. If you tag yourself to somebody, if you're not in a squad, if you're in a squad, you tag yourself to the squad, you cover all corners. Simple as. But if you're by yourself, what you have to do is you have to find a buddy, follow him around, make sure the French can't get 2 kills picked apart. If they kill that one guy, you respond. You have to do this, and if you don't do this, what will happen is he will die, and then they'll just go around and kill you, because you're not playing defensively already, because that's supposedly not how you play the game. But it is going to be how you play the game. A fundamental shift is going to have to happen with German players. You can't just keep complaining about the game. This is something that has been happening for a long time, and this is more of like a get off my chest kind of thing. Not really to do with the podcast, this is kind of the ending to it. I'm feeling a lot better, I haven't coughed at all through this, so let's get down to business. German tankers have been complaining since the Americans were released. The reason for this is because they weren't top dog anymore. And then at 6.7, their beautiful BR, it was invaded by T-34s, T-29s, T-92s, Scorpions, Carnarvons, FV-4202s, Centurion Mark 10s, Mark 3s. It was invaded by some other vehicles from Russia, such as the Su-100P, the T-44-100, of course the infamous IS-6, which yes, I agree with, but we'll talk about everything else, since that has been changed. And now you have the French. There has got to be a point where instead of just complaining, you have to change your playstyle. You have to change how you approach these vehicles. You can't just keep saying this is unfair. Try something else. Adapt. That's what the Americans had to do. That's what Pershing drivers had to do. Back in the day, when I was using my damn Pershing and I was facing Tiger 2Hs, was that a fun experience? No, not for the first week when I had to get parts, FPE and everything else, but what it taught me was how to deal with a Tiger 2 without facing it frontally. If you see a Tiger 2 frontally, what you do and how you approach it. And I've taken that knowledge through American lines now, through the British lines, and through the French lines. And I believe a lot of players are exactly in the position where I'm at. So because of that, we know your tricks. We know how to face your vehicles and annihilate you. So what you have to do is change or die. Right now, German teams are dying. They have incredibly low win rates, and no, it's not because your Panther II is not at 6.7. Put the damn Panther II at 6.7, and the same shit'll happen. Because the Panther II is not as good as shit like the Lorraine and the AMX M4 when it comes to the aggressive playstyle, and it'll get shit on. And it'll be hilarious to watch, because then what are you going to complain about? You already have the RU251 at 6.7. A ridiculous vehicle at 6.7. Yes, it's premium, but it seems like all of you fuckers have bought them. Go play that. And if you still complain about 6.7, I don't even know what to do. You've got to adapt. Everybody else did. Everybody else adapted to play against Germans. We had to. But now German teams have to adapt. They just bitch instead. And to be honest, it's getting kind of infuriating. I got a comment response a very long time ago, which was asking about how to play Germany. And it was a really fun video to make. I focused on the Panzer IV, the Tiger II-H. I made a lot of very similar points to this in this video back then, just not related to French tanks, because, you know, French tanks didn't exist. And all of those points still stand today, but none of them have been taken up by anyone. And what's going to happen is it's going to keep getting worse, and you're just going to lose. And you're going to keep losing. And people are going to still keep laughing at German teams, because you don't adapt. And you just will keep getting smashed lower and lower into the grave. Until nobody will play Germany, and then people will be like, oh, well, why doesn't anyone play Germany? Because they didn't adapt, not because their tanks aren't good enough. They just didn't change. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. As I said before, the podcast itself is in the description below. Go and have a look. Very, very worth your time. It's a good talk. And I'll see you next time.